Assalamu alaikum, welcome back. You are listening to the Mehreen Mia Show on Salam Media. I hope you are staying safe, keeping warm. It's quite cold around the country today. And if you are not at home, I hope you are still warm wherever you are. It is time for our empowered segment with Sister Mehreen Mia Cassimjee, who is a motivational speaker and life coach. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Sister Mehreen.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you, Sister Mehreen?
Okay, Sister Mehreen, I just feel a bit under the weather, coming down with the flu, and yeah, I'm just hopeful that it's not that C word.
So, inshallah, Allah will give you complete shifa, inshallah, and won't be the C word at all. But inshallah, you will have shifa soon as you dua.
Ameen, thumma ameen. All right, Sister Mehreen, let's start.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So, Sister Mehreen, we did start discussing before the concept of perception, and today I want to speak a little bit about this perception, but also what we know as a perspective. And first of all, let's establish for our listeners that there is a difference between perception and perspective. So someone may ask, but aren't they the same or similar? And for me, there's a no. Because in my opinion, there's a difference, and yet the understanding of that difference is what is key for us to know ourselves better and to learn how to change certain things within ourselves. So perception is your understanding and of maybe your interpretation of something, how you would interpret someone that's in front of you, how you interpret different people around you, how you interpret a situation for yourself, how you would interpret a circumstance that you're experiencing. So your perception is your interpretation of the world around you, basically. And I like to put that into a word that's called mental impression. Your perception is your mental impression of what's happening around you. Perspective, on the other hand, is a kind of an angle from which you can see something. So when you're interpreting, for example, listening to Mehreen, your perspective is what angle am I using in creating that mental impression or my perception of her. So what my perspective is linked directly to what your perception of the certain thing might be. So your perspective is literally your point of view, basically. Now, understanding this and how it works it really affects how we would interact with each other. And we interact with people at different levels all the time, Sister Mehreen. And that's where that sense of self-awareness comes in, because we did speak about awareness before. So understanding the differences between the perception and the perspective is what allows you to become more aware of certain things, and then also helps you to enhance your level of tolerance so that you're able to understand what is your perception of certain things and your perspective and how you might need to change it, etc. Because remember, when you are working with other people, you're living with other people, you encounter other people in different places. Sometimes you're in physically challenged spaces as well, and the environments warrant certain things. And your different levels of perception and what your perspectives are help you to then understand what your reaction to those different elements must be. So some may say, for example, I live in the same house as my spouse and as my children, so I know them better. But remember, like you have your perspective and like you have your perceptions of things, each of those people around you in their individual capacities, they too have their different perceptions and perspectives. So it allows for you to be aware of yours, but also to respect those around them. And when we look at perception, like I said, we're looking at a mental impression, but perception is very personal orientated. Let me explain that a little bit. When I say it's personal orientated, when you have a perception of something, it's your own personal mental impression of what it is. And by that I mean, let's take an example of a sound or a smell of something. What is your perception of a specific sound and a specific smell? Now, these little pieces of sensory interpretation that you put into yourself create your perception of it. So your perception of, for example, a specific volume or a tone of voice is something that will actually be different for somebody else, and everyone will have a different perception of the same thing. So if you're somebody who has a perception of, what is your perception, for example, of baking of bread, the smell that comes from there? What is your perception of somebody that speaks very loudly all the time? Because each of your perceptions on these different things are directly linked to how you look at it and how you create your perspective on them. The reason I'm pointing that out now is because these differences that we have are also based in why I say personal, because it's based in how certain things are embedded within us. So there are lots of elements and forces that are attached to, for example, our perception of certain things. So if you think about how you feel if somebody is raising onions on a stove, do you like it or don't you like it? How many times is it that we smell a loaf of bread baking and it reminds us of grandma's house? So the perception is personal because it's keyed into a program that's inside you over years of what you're going through. Now, I spoke of the elements and filters that we have regarding perception. Some of them are just role models that you have. You follow a specific role model and you want to be how they are, so you try and have perceptions of things like they have. The belief systems, culture systems. Lots of people have perceptions on certain aspects of life because of certain belief systems that they follow. It's a lot of things. You have judgments that come up. Your different life experiences as well are what create your different perceptions of things. What are your preferences to certain things? Now, each of these things obviously makes it hard for you to become objective, because if you're somebody who has lived in a specific space where the perception of a specific thing was very good, and then you move out of that space, and in growing yourself, you find that the same aspect that you thought was perceived in a certain way, you now want to change your perception. And that's where lots of people have difficulty now, because it's a fight between my growing self and what I grew with. So your perception might always change, even though your circumstances may be the same. So you will start off as a little child, maybe liking and perceiving something in a certain way. And as you grow older, your perception of the exact same thing would become different. The question becomes, is it going to be a respected difference, or is it going to be, no, I need it for you to be how I want you to be set to be? So that's where lots of difficulties come in terms of empowerment and the self. And that difference in understanding the perception versus perspective comes in there, is where you can learn the tolerance to respect this of everyone else around you. Now, everyone we know is unique in their perception of things, and everybody is unique in how their belief system is, and we need to learn that tolerance level and respect. But I'm going to use a quick analogy so that people can understand what I mean by perception and how it's embedded within you and it can change. If you take something as simple as a breakfast buffet table, there are some people out there who can eat a curry and a roti for breakfast, for example. You have others that are out there who think that is really something you're not supposed to be doing. You have to have a fried egg and a fried sausage with a toast. And you have others who feel that it has to just be cereal. For goodness sake, you can't eat a curry for breakfast. How do you have that? So everybody has a different perception of what needs to be at a breakfast buffet table. What happens when you go to a hotel or any lodge or anything, even around the world? The breakfast buffet table caters for every one of those people. Whether you like the curry, whether you like the egg or the omelette, or whether you just want the cereal or you want something sweet or a cake or a croissant, that breakfast buffet table caters for them all. Why is that? Because if you have to ask yourself a question as to which of those breakfast buffet choices, whether it's the curry or the cereal or the juice with the egg and the sausage, which one of them is the correct one? There is no correct one. All of them are correct, because it's a perception and what everybody feels is good for them. So hotels around the world, for example, I'm not going to tell you you're obligated to have this because you're not space. They cater for everybody and everybody's needs. That's exactly where it comes from. The breakfast buffet table can teach us a lot about life lessons as well, and how we respect each other and each other's perceptions, and we cater for them, because you can't enforce what you feel as your perception onto somebody else, and that's very key. Here's what the crux of this whole thing is, though. Changing your perception of a situation, or even your perception of a person, your perception of a circumstance, can definitely change your perspective on them. I'll say that again. The perception of the situation or the person or any circumstance that you're encountering, that can change your perspective about it. So let's just say you as a person believe that if you're somebody who's very outspoken and you're this extrovert person, then you must be very successful. Let's just say that's your belief system. You believe that you have to be an extrovert, and so you believe that you are an extrovert and you're going to be successful because that was the embedded perception of what an extrovert should be. And then suddenly you're faced with going into a space that has like over 50 people in there, and you're supposed to be this extrovert who now is able to cope, but suddenly you find you in a space where there's 50 people around you and you're not really comfortable suddenly. Suddenly you feel like this is not my zone. I'm not really supposed to be this. Because you have this perception that the extrovert is supposed to be good and successful amongst people, suddenly you're made to feel, because it's going against the grain for you, you're around these people, you're suddenly feeling uncomfortable, and you're not really in tune with that. You can start feeling, I'm a failure, I'm not really good at this. You start thinking negative about yourself. In the meantime, it's not the case. It's just that you need to change your perspective on how you're viewing you as yourself. So remember when you said, and you set the stance to say, you as an extrovert, you will be successful. You determined for yourself when you said that you have to be the extrovert to be successful. Now all you need to do is re-look at that and actually try and reassess what success means. Success is not because you're an extrovert. Success has to be redefined for you according to different perceptions. The different perception you will then have of what this is what will be your perspective on how successful you can be. So there's a difference between the both, which we have to understand in order to learn how to make changes that are best for each of us and to grow each of us. And I think the last question, and I think many people would ask Sister Mehreen when it comes to this is, yes, okay, so if this is my perception and this is my perspective, what about if other people have certain perceptions and perspectives? Can that change? Can I change somebody else's perspective or perception of certain things? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, you can. You can't enforce yours on them, but you can try and help them to change theirs. How? The first thing, and again, it's about respect, but before you can even try and assist to change somebody else's perspective on something, you need to first understand why they have that perspective. So if you go back to those elements I spoke about earlier, like the belief system where you grew up with the strategy or certain traits of a role model that you like, if those are your reasons for you having a specific perception on something, then whoever wants to try and change it needs to understand where your sense of perception comes from so they know your reasons for why you have that sense of perception. So if you want to change anybody's perception about something, it's definitely possible, but you have to learn to find out exactly where and establish why they have that specific perception that they have, and then try and figure out what is it about their perception that you can try and show them about your perception that is different. So for something to be clear, remember, you need to be able to address it with them so that they can acknowledge that they have their perception and you have yours. So when you try and tell somebody your different point of view, don't go about it demanding that they understand you or commanding that your point of view is. The first thing you need to always acknowledge when you try and change somebody's perception of something is acknowledge that they have a right to their perception. Just that alone creates that level of respect. So I acknowledge that Sister Mehreen has the right to her perception about the sunlight today. But I'm going to just share my viewpoint and my perception because I feel that when I'm in the sun, sometimes it dries my skin too much. So it might not be all that too good. And automatically, Sister Mehreen is going to start loving the sun, but she's going to see a different point of view and a different perspective or angle of how to see the sunlight now. So how you actually tackle speaking to somebody about changing their perception is key because you're not going to want to demand. Remember, I can't control somebody else's mindset and I can't control their decisions, but I can control the decision-making process and what their perceptions are. How do you do that? By diplomatically actually just speaking about it. And the first thing that has to happen is you actually acknowledging where they come from, you're acknowledging your respect for their perception and their perspective, and then you're going to let them know what yours are and how that can change. So remember, all of us need to remember that perception is what you interpret. It's your understanding of the situation Perception is your understanding of a person, of an object, and it's about the meaning that you give to something. And that is what is important for your point of view. So it's your perspective on something is created from the perception you have. So I have a perception of loving women and women to be empowered. And my perspective on it is that I need to be able to help women to grow that. So your perception that you have about certain things is directly linked to how your perspective is about them. And your perspective about what you perceive is directly linked to how you react to them. So when you want to train yourself to become more empowered in certain instances, the first thing you need to become aware of is, what are my perceptions about certain things? Because once you're aware of them and you're aware of the angle and your perspective on certain things, then you know whether you need to change them or not. Without such awareness, it's going to be very difficult. So remember that there is a difference between the perspective and perception and the perspective, but that's surface value. The real importance is to understand the difference between them so that you can see the difference in your life so that you can make changes for you for the better, inshallah.
Inshallah. And how can we use perception and perspective in situations like this pandemic?
If you take, for example, I think before I did use an example of a little child where I did a session with them to try and curb the fear that they have of the pandemic. And one of the things we did with the children was to ask them to draw what they think the pandemic was. And some of them drew lovely things, some of them drew scary things. And I remember one that I still use today is the one of the octopus. So if you take that as an example, how are you perceiving, what is your perception of this virus? Ask yourself that. Each of the listeners listening, and ask yourself, how am I perceiving this virus? What is my perception of it at the moment? What was my perception of this virus in day one of lockdown in March or April? What is my perception of the virus now? And based on all of the intel that I have up to date about this virus, what is now my current perspective? So your reactions to the virus currently, are you wearing a mask still? Are you somebody who just felt, you know what, I'm not going to wear this mask anymore because there's no need. I think the numbers drop. Are you somebody who's just becoming lapsed about it? Or are you somebody who's still really maintaining that control because you don't want the second wave to hit? So how you're reacting to the virus currently is very dependent on what your perspective is on the virus. If you're somebody whose perspective on the virus is it's still there, I need to still maintain my precautions and protocols, we all need to still be careful, then obviously your actions will be the same. Your actions will be paramount, and you'll take extra care and you'll make sure things are done properly. So when it comes to this pandemic, people out there currently are facing a lot worse than just issues with the virus. They're facing poverty, they're facing unemployment, we're facing GBV at a higher rate. So there's a lot of other factors happening because of the pandemic. And we have to ask ourselves, are we now perceiving and having this perspective that even though the pandemic is at that bad, we have other things to worry about, so we're not really worrying about the pandemic anymore? So what exactly is your perspective on the virus itself and the pandemic? How is it affecting you? And then based on your perspective, ask yourself, how am I actually reacting to it and what am I doing to make it better?
Mm-hmm. And some people have perceived the virus as, or rather the lockdown, as a means of something positive in their lives. Perhaps they've saved money, perhaps they've managed to have a healthy lifestyle, perhaps they've
Yes,
have strengthened their relationships and bonds with their families. So at the end of the day, it's just how you perceive it, like you've mentioned.
absolutely. And you know, the thing is, the virus was initially seen as it's an enemy. But like I said, you can't control this virus. You can only control you. You can control your reaction to it. So if you embrace it and embrace the circumstance that is out there, I have got so many of us, and I say us because I'm included, that have learned so much more about me as a person. We've learned different tactics. We've learned different ways of learning different skills.
Mm-hmm. Sister Mehreen, are you still there? Oh, it seems like we have lost Sister Mehreen there. Anyways, if you have any comments or questions or suggestions for her, please send them to us on WhatsApp. The number is 061 766 0355. You can also leave them in the comment section below and send them to our DMs as well. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And would like to know what you think about perception and perspective, especially when it comes to this pandemic, this virus, this lockdown. How have you perceived it? Have things changed from the beginning of the lockdown, from the beginning of the pandemic? And where are you now in your life? Are you doing things differently? Have you learned a lot about yourself? Basically, sit down one day and just write down about your perception and your perspective, how you started seeing things, and how you interpret them. That's perception is the interpretation of something, and then perspective is the angle in which you see it. That means your point of view. All right. Thank you for joining me. We've lost Sister Mehreen, but that's fine. She will be joining me again next week, Wednesday, from 12 right here on the Mehreen Mia Show on Salam Media. But for now, just stay with us. We'll be right back.